Hi guys, today's video is about the endocrine system because it connects really well to how cells signal and kind of like applies it to why it's important to your body. So we're going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be doing a lot of writing today on the slide, so I hope that you will write along with me. All right, so to start off, we're just going to talk about what the endocrine system actually is, and it is a series of hormone producing glands. So hormone producing glands. And a hormone is just a chemical signal that is produced in one part of your body and travels through your circulatory system to another part of your body. And we call the part of the body that it's traveling to the target cell. You'll see that as we go throughout this video. The endocrine system is really important for controlling the body's functions, and it even has impacts on like your mood and that sort of stuff. Of course, the nervous system is also really important for controlling the body's functions, but the endocrine system is like a big part of that as well. Really important for the endocrine system's ability to actually function is the circulatory system. I'm just going to put a little note here that says the circulatory system is responsible for moving hormones around the body to their target cells. And the target cells, of course, will be like whatever part of the body they're affecting. This endocrine system works on a series of like feedback loops, which is going to actually be my next video. But I just want to make a little note about what that means today. Basically, it means that the results of the hormone will trigger either the response to like continue happening or the response to stop happening. So there's two types of feedback, negative and positive. Here, feedback. Negative means that the stimulus will be reduced. And this is more common in your body. And then positive is going to amplify the stimulus. And this is less common, which I think probably makes sense because if you think about amplifying the stimulus, you're thinking about making something bigger that's like throwing the body out of homeostasis. So typically you want to reduce the effect of the stimulus so that the body like stays more neutral. Soybean has a lot to say. I don't know if you can hear her, but she's like very passionate about this topic, I guess. Okay, let's continue. So I want to just talk about a few important glands and hormones. I'm not going to talk about all of them because there are so many, but I'll show you a sort of map of the body's glands um, in a few moments. But these are some major glands, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what hormones they produce and where they're located. So, first of all, the anterior pituitary gland is located in the brain. It is responsible for secreting something called tropic hormones. Change colors. Secretes tropic hormones. And this word tropic, which looks like tropic, but it's not tropic, means that it's a hormone that controls the release of other hormones. So this controls release of more hormones. One example of this is human growth hormone, which I'm going to talk more about at the end of this video. I'll just say here that this is human growth hormone, which obviously I think is responsible for you growing and triggering sort of growth spurts, those sorts of things. That's the anterior pituitary gland. Also, really important part of the endocrine system is the pancreas. Pancreas is located in your abdomen. It's a small gland that's responsible for regulating your blood sugar. This regulates blood sugar. Two hormones that are really important for this process, and I'm going to talk about this picture, which is actually a pancreas cross section, are insulin, which is probably the most famous one because of the role it plays in diabetes, and glucagon. And these two hormones antagonize one another, so that means that they have the opposite effect on the body, but they're both produced by the pancreas. So I'm going to go over here and talk about this little cross section. So you have a whole bunch of different types of cells that are hanging out in your pancreas and doing different jobs. But two that are really important are the beta cells and the alpha cells. Let's start with the beta cells, which are in the picture, they're the light blue color. Their job is to secrete insulin. And they do this when blood sugar levels are high. And how they know blood sugar levels are high is what we talked about before Thanksgiving, the cell signaling pathway. So in this situation, the sugar in the blood is the signal molecule. So once they sense that that's happening, they release the insulin. What insulin does, so I'll say insulin triggers liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen or fat. And that is the job of insulin. That's done by beta cells. On the flip side, there are alpha cells. I'll put them over here. They're the dark blue cells in the picture. Alpha cells are responsible for secreting glucagon. You probably are able to guess, oops, I wanted that to be what glucagon does. But if you couldn't, what happens is that blood sugar levels are low. We'll say when blood sugar levels are low. And what glucagon does is it triggers the liver to break down and release glycogen. And when it does that, it will release the glycogen in the form of glucose. Okay. So those are the two hormones of the pancreas. They're both equally important, although you've probably heard more about insulin, but they're both responsible for maintaining homeostasis in terms of blood sugar levels. And you may know that blood sugar getting either too high or too low is actually really dangerous for a person's health. So Those are your pancreatic hormones. Okay, let's keep going. I'm going to go back over here, and now we're going to talk about the thyroid. The thyroid is located in the throat, and it's a butterfly shaped gland in your throat. Its job is to regulate metabolism. And we're going to talk about this a lot this week, actually, in class. I'm not going to talk about it a ton, but I will just put on here that some example hormones are thyroid hormone, which we abbreviate as TH3 and TH4. We'll talk about them more in class. So I'm going to keep going. And then finally, some really important glands of your body are your gonads, which are your sex organs. So these are responsible for producing sex hormones. It's different whether you're a male or a female, of course. So males produce testosterone, and the location of that will be the testes. And females, mainly, the biggest one is estrogen, but there are several other hormones that females produce, and that is produced in the ovaries. Both estrogen and testosterone are lipid-based hormones, which is really important for how they're received by the cell, which I'll talk about next. They're lipid-based hormones. The other ones are protein hormones, so they'll be received by the cell a little bit differently. Okay, so now let me show you the map of the hormones. So here they are. Here's a whole bunch of them. The heart is included on here. It's not technically a gland, which you can see it says organs containing endocrine glands. But the heart is really mostly responsible for circulating these hormones around the body, and that's why it's really important to the endocrine system. And then on the left side, you can see the actual glands of the endocrine system. Several in the brain, and then there's the thyroid in the throat. An interesting thing about thyroids, which you may have heard before, but thyroids are the site of goiters. That's where goiters happen. And goiters were actually like a very common ailment in like the early 1900s because people weren't getting enough iodine. And the thyroid needs iodine to produce the hormones that it makes. And so when people had iodine deficiencies, the thyroid actually swells up and causes a goiter. It almost looks like a bullfrog throat. So what people figured out is that if they put iodine in salt, then people wouldn't have an iodine deficiency because everybody eats salt. And it worked. And now if you look at salt that you buy at the store, it has to be like regular salt, not like pink Himalayan salt or anything like that. But if you look at your salt and it says iodized, that's the reason why it's iodized, to prevent goiters and keep you goiter free. Just an interesting fact about that. And then there are a few others on here that I didn't talk about. Adrenal glands are really interesting because they have a lot to do with stress, actually. But we'll talk about other ones throughout, or of course, if there's one you're really interested in, you should definitely research it. Alrighty. So now let's talk about how these hormones actually work. There's two options, and it depends on whether they're lipid hormones or not. So the first one, method one, is for lipid hormones like estrogen or testosterone. And of course, you know that steroids are examples of lipids. So what they can do, because they are lipids, is pass through the cell membrane. So I'll just say pass through cell membrane. And then once they do that, they can bind to a receptor that's actually inside of the cytoplasm and not on the cell membrane like the ones we talked about last week. So once they're in the cell, they will bind to a receptor in the cytoplasm. And then the receptor is able to modify gene expression. Which, when we say modifies gene expression, that means it's going to start transcription or stop it for a specific gene. So for hormones like estrogen and testosterone, it's really pretty simple because they're able to pass through the membrane very easily because they're nonpolar lipid-based molecules. Method two is for molecules that are protein based. And these are going to be things like insulin, human growth hormone, glucagon, most of the ones that I talked about previously. So, because they can't easily get into the cell because they're polar and they're very large, they are going to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. So, bind to receptor on cell membrane. After binding to the receptor, the cell is able to accept the hormone using endocytosis. So this is called receptor-mediated endocytosis. It means that the endocytosis will only be triggered when the hormone actually binds to the receptor. So once it's bound, the cell basically like creates this pit and takes in the hormone and also the receptor. After that, the cell uses second messengers, just like we talked about in signal. Second messengers are triggered. And you might remember that second messengers are responsible for amplifying the response. For these hormones, there are two main second messengers that are used. One of them is our good friend CAMP, AMP. Cyclic AMP is going to trigger the same phosphorylation cascade that we talked about last time. Phosphorylation cascade, which the enzymes that are responsible for this are kinases. And the phosphates come from ATP. Once this happens, this is the transduction part, it leads to the response. So this leads to changes in gene expression. And that will be the response. The other second messenger is a new one that we haven't talked about yet. It's abbreviated as IP3. And that stands for inositol triphosphate. So that's where the 3 comes from. I'm going to actually write that on there. This is triphosphate. Its job is to actually trigger a release of calcium ions. Triggers calcium ion release from the endoplasmic reticulum. Just going to write as the ER. What those calcium ions then do is they trigger enzymes to start to turn on. So they act as um, cofactors for the enzymes. So this activates specific enzymes. Oops. That then alter gene expression. So just two ways to amplify the signal, transduce the signal, and then eventually lead to a response. Both of them are going to end up causing changes in gene expression, and so is the first option. Method one is also going to change gene expression as well. That's the purpose of a hormone. Okay, so now let's look at some examples. Here's the first one. This is a pretty simple hormone pathway here. And then you can see that negative feedback is occurring, which I referenced at the very beginning. So the stimulus here, what causes the hormone to start to respond, is low pH in the duodenum. So the stimulus, or what causes the endocrine cell to start to respond, is that the cell is able to sense that the pH is really low in the duodenum. The duodenum is the part of your small intestine that connects right to your stomach. And low pH, of course, is acidic. Oops. Um, Interesting fact about the duodenum is that it is the um, place of your body where the most nutrients are actually absorbed from your food. Fun fact. Okay, so once that happens, cells that are called S cells are able to secrete a hormone called secretin that goes to the pancreas. It travels through the blood. That's what makes it endocrine. And then in the pancreas cells are triggered to release bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is basic, and that reduces the stimulus, which was the acidity in the small intestine. So what you have there is negative feedback because the response of the pathway caused the stimulus to lessen. That's good because it leads to homeostasis being maintained. So hooray. All right, let's look at another example. This is called a neuroendocrine pathway. Because it is directly involved with nerves. We'll say just because nerves are involved in hormone release. So this example has to do with breastfeeding. The stimulus is the baby suckling. And then what happens is the sensory neuron can feel that. It tells the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus that that's happening. The nerves of that part of the brain are able to secrete a hormone called oxytocin, which triggers the muscles of the breasts to release milk so that the baby can actually be fed. And that is positive feedback because it actually amplifies the stimulus. So what happens is once the baby actually gets milk, they're able to suckle even more. And then that creates the pathway just continuing to be active. That's an example of positive feedback. It's one of the few. The other big example is childbirth and contractions is the other example of positive feedback. All right, let's look at one more. All right, so this example is a little bit more complicated because it involves tropic hormones. So what's happening here is that the stimulus is cold. Your sensory neurons are able to feel that you're cold. They tell your brain, your hypothalamus, that that's how you're feeling. The hypothalamus then releases hormones that trigger the pituitary to release more hormones. So you have a few examples here of tropic hormones. The first one is the releasing hormone that comes from the hypothalamus. That tells the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. Then another tropic hormone is released. That's called thyroid stimulating hormone. And that stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4, which are the hormones that actually are able to affect target cells, which in this case are all different body tissues around the cell because, or around the body, sorry, because it's going to increase the metabolism of those cells. Increased metabolism means increased heat. And that will be negative feedback because it's going to reduce the stimulus. So examples of that, like manifesting in your body, are things like shivering, things like your hair standing up, those sorts of reactions to cold that you think of as like adaptive responses are because of these pathways that are making sure that homeostasis is able to be maintained for you, which is amazing. So this is an example of a pathway that uses tropic hormones. Okay, one more thing I want to do an example of is human growth hormone. So human growth hormone is also called HGH. It comes from the pituitary gland. Which is, of course, in the brain. And the target cell is the liver. Target cells. So what happens when it travels to the liver is then triggered to release insulin-like growth factors. And these are called IGFs. They will be protein hormones because they are insulin-like. IGFs stimulate the growth of bones and cartilage. And that allows for growth. There are examples of people having either too much human growth hormone or not enough human growth hormone, and those are endocrine disorders. So if someone has low human growth hormone, that is called pituitary dwarfism. It's not the same as the genetic disorder dwarfism, we'll talk about later on. That's an inherited dominant trait. And then if you have high human growth hormone, you actually have a disorder called gigantism. And these are two examples of endocrine disorders. There are many examples, and we're going to explore some of them in class, but this is just a few. Examples. Okay, awesome. So in summary, the endocrine system is really important for making sure that responses happen in your body that are all the way across your body. So when you think about the size of a cell and the size of a hormone, your body is really, really large. And this system of your body is able to use cell signaling to actually make sure that you survive and that you stay in balance and are able to do things like regulate blood sugar, regulate metabolism, and respond to stimuli in the external environment. So thanks for watching and see you soon. Bye.